Okay. We are live and direct and we are unmuted, I believe. Thank you for that reminder. Um, Last live stream, I, you know what, I'm just not going to hit the mute button anymore. How about that? That's just the easiest way to avoid any clumsy happenstances. And if there happens to be any situation where there's a little bit of an echo, live with it because I cannot risk having another 3 to 5 minute mutathon again. Um, Thank you for joining me, guys. And this one has been on my radar. This live stream that I'm doing has been on my radar for some time. I've been meaning to do it for so long. Now, obviously, you know I like a bit of clickbait, so don't read too much into the title. Certainly, DNA studies are not all complete and utter lies, and they're not entirely useless. However, if you're a member of the channel and a subscriber, and you tune in regularly enough to my material, you'll know that I remain what I believe to be a healthy skeptic of genetic testing, particularly testing around uniparental markers and the interpretation of SNPs. Now, the one thing I'm not going to do is in this live stream is this is going to be really quite basic. I'm not going to presume everybody's got a degree in genetics. I certainly do not. So I'm going to preface this by saying I'm not a geneticist. Okay, I'm not qualified in this area. I'm quite open to say that. So the criticisms that I have regarding genetic testing and regarding process has got nothing to do with me being some expert in the field. It all boils down to common sense. So I'm not approaching this from a perspective that I'm some authority and you must listen to me. In fact, a lot of the information I'm going to give you is not going to be coming out of my mouth. It's going to be coming out of the mouth of other people. So I've got a lot of kind of videos for us to watch today, a lot of data for us to get through, and consider this just a very simple introduction for you to understand why I remain skeptical about the current use, interpretation, and, for want of a better word, manipulation of the data that's being given to us from genetic testing and by genetic testing. And this is being done sometimes totally innocuously by genetic testing companies because they simply have got skewed databases, but it's also being done rather nefariously by people who have agendas, such as the Krauss and Schunemann study, which, they went into that study with an agenda to disprove the blackness of the ancient Egyptians. That was the agenda. They made it very clear from the title of the study. So you get these different approaches, but ultimately there are some really key milestones, some really key areas, some really key things that I think people are missing. And these are, I respect most people who are in this field. And I even see people who I really highly respect making errors. What I interpret as errors in terms of how trusting they are of the information that they're receiving and not actually being aware of the fact that the data they've been given is incredibly skewed or incredibly incorrect. So we're going to cover that today. We're going to take it at a relatively easy pace. I really would like to get as much feedback from you as I'm doing this, guys. So if I'm going too fast, if I'm going too slow, just let me know the pace is okay, because it's going to be one of those live streams where we've got a lot to cover. It's going to be information packed. I mean, the last live stream I did, I'm almost a glutton for punishment because the last live stream I did was quite information packed as well. It was very dense. This one's not going to be any lighter, but to me personally, once I get these two live streams out of the way, so the one I've done already was the phenotypic matrix. That was like a big one. But now I've done that, I can just reference it and I no longer have to kind of like ad nauseum go into that subject. And it's the same thing with this subject. People always asking me, oh, you're going to cover this genetic testing. What do you think about this marker? And you'll notice that I stay really silent. So even, and I know this is going to kind of like, I hope this doesn't offend some people, but people kind of like post on my, I'm related to Ramesses the third because I've got the E1, and I'll stay really silent. And that's not me saying that I don't appreciate the fact that you share that marker. That's me being consistent. Because if I'm going to celebrate the fact that you have that marker, then I then have to start arguing against all of these ridiculous, occurrences of markers where Eurasians will say, oh, well, this marker was found in this ancient Egyptian, so therefore I'm he. And if you go down that line, you have to understand that's you're committing to it. And my approach is always genetic testing is useful, but it's useful amongst a field of anthropology. You can't separate genetic testing from anthropology. And when you do that, what you get is these really ridiculous, spurious conclusions being made by people who are in the field, particularly not geneticists, by the way, because geneticists you'll find today, actually, by the end of the day, you've got to realize geneticists agree with me on this. So geneticists aren't the ones who are making all these far-fetched conclusions about when they find SNP markers and this, that, and the other, saying, oh, these people must be this race and must be from this area because they carry this marker. Geneticists don't do that. In fact, geneticists will tell you quite easily that's pretty much pseudoscience. You want to avoid that approach. The only thing that markers are going to tell you is maybe a bit of information about movement. If you know that the two people carrying the same markers here got it from the same source, you might be getting an idea of movement of where they moved from one place to the other. But you can't remove genetic testing from anthropology. And when I say anthropology, I mean cultural anthropology, physical anthropology, biological anthropology. There's I can't remember I think I've only given you two there because physical and biological are the same ones: cultural anthropology, linguistic anthropology, and there's another one. But basically, the major fields of study in terms of people and populations. You can't just study genetics in isolation and think you're going to get a clear picture, because you're not, and I'm going to demonstrate that today. So I hope you're with me. If you're not with me, or if I'm losing you a bit, stay with me, because like I said, we're going to really walk through this, okay? And I'm going to go through some real basics, but I think it's important because I can't just, like I said, make the presumption that everyone is at this kind of like, everyone is as boring as me and maybe a few others. Wesker's in here as well, and Jonathan. I know Jonathan's one of them. Not everyone's gonna be like us and boring, sitting down on our weekend, digesting papers, peer-reviewed studies, and most people aren't gonna do that on their weekend. So I'd say let's approach this from a kind of a joint perspective. Let's really take our time with this. If I don't manage to get through all of the kind of information that I wanted to cover in this live stream, then I can always make a part two. This is such a dense subject that I'm going to put a cap on it myself. I'm going to put a physical or mental delimiter on myself to say when we hit a certain point, we're not going to get 2 hours. I'll close it down before we get 2 hours, and I'll say, you know what? Part two. Okay, so that's where I sit. So look, guys, if you're with me at the moment, because I've been rambling on for a little bit, but if you're with me, it's making sense, and the live stream sounds interesting to you, hit up the likes and the hearts now. Let me see them. Let me know that you are with me on this subject. Galvanize me with a little bit of encouragement, so I know, okay, cool, everyone's here, everyone's on it, everyone's enjoying it, everyone likes the sound of it. And I think there's a little bit of a delay. So I'm going to wait for some of those likes to start popping up, and then I'll know, okay, cool, I've got them, they're interested. Let's get this rolling. Lovely. Seen a few coming through. Lovely. Hit them likes, hit them hearts. Likes and hearts. Nice. All right. Nice. You with me? Let's go. All right. I'm actually quite excited about this because I think Jonathan posted in the comments. By the way, Jonathan, thank you very much for that $10 donation. That was before the live stream even started. I really, really appreciate that. And Jonathan posted, he's been looking forward to this. So, that's no pressure there. But also, I'm not going to lie, I've been looking forward to it as well, because it's such a loaded topic. And I really just wanted to dive in and tell you what I feel about this whole subject. So let's go. All right, so I'm going to start in a strange place, actually. So here's where I'm going to start. I'm going to start with an article that I think will be really useful for us to read together. Is this it here? Yeah, okay. So I'm going to start with this article, okay? Now, I know some of you may have seen this before, but this article is a really good one. And why is it a really good one? Because in essence, it typifies my entire skepticism and my entire reason for disliking the current approach to how DNA is not only viewed but also interpreted. So this article says half of European men share King Tut's DNA. Now bear with me, because we are going to read this entire article, and obviously we're going to debunk it. It debunks itself, but we're obviously going to debunk it. Okay, so up to 70% of British men and half of Western European men are related to the Egyptian pharaoh Tutankhamun, geneticists in Switzerland said. Now, we're going to pause right there, okay? Because they've used the word, a very loaded word then, said related to. So all these men, it hasn't just said they're sharing a marker, it says they're related to the Egyptian pharaoh Tutankhamun. Now, you must understand, SNP markers don't tell you anything about relation. Okay, and we'll come to that, but they don't tell you anything about relation. Two people carrying the same markers may not be related, in that the marker has an origin point. This particular marker, I think, dates back about 15,000 years. The relationship 15,000 years ago is so small, it's astronomical. And actually, I'm going to show you in a forthcoming video today that all people on the planet alive today have a more recent common ancestor than the origin of that marker. So if we all have a more recent common ancestor, then we cannot judge any relation by these markers. They don't tell you anything about relationship, because you don't know where along that line you split from that person in terms of, in terms of that marker. It could have been right at the first generation, that person who made that marker 15,000 years ago could have had two sons. Okay, one son could have gone to Europe, the other son could have gone to Africa, and you're of King Tut's of the African branch, all of Europe's of the European branch. They're not related. He's not related to any of them. That's how markers can work, and I'm going to be depicting this later. So please stay with me if I'm losing you a little bit with this. But I just want to jump on that word, related. It's totally meaningless in this discussion. Scientists at Zurich, so let's carry on from here. Scientists at Zurich-based DNA genealogy center ydna reconstructed the DNA profile of the boy pharaoh who ascended to the throne at the age of 9. His father Akhenaten and grandfather Amenhotep III, of which I have reconstructions of all three of them. So if you want to know what they look like, from my perspective, please do check out the channel. Based on a film that was made for the Discovery Channel. The results showed King Tut belonged to genetic profile known as haplogroup R1b1a2. Please do bear that in mind. Try and remember that. Please remember that. To which more than 50% of all men in Western Europe belong. So more than 50% of men in Western Europe belong. Now, if you're in my live stream, the last one, I mentioned this very marker and the fact that 50% of Western European men carry it, 70% of British men carry it, 90% of Irish men carry it. And I mentioned that all this proves is that for a long period of time in Europe, the current people who proliferate Europe had very unhealthy breeding habits, because no single marker should have that kind of proliferation across an old population. So either they've all remained incredibly, for want of a better word, inbred for a long period of time, or, and this is much more plausible, they're a much more recent population, so they don't have old roots. You won't find a single marker in Africa that has that kind of proliferation or anywhere near that kind of proliferation, because we're an older population and we have diversity even within small populations, and within tribes and ethnicities we carry far more diversity than that. And it's really important that that's communicated, because this is communicated to us like it's some kind of strength or something to boast about, and that on a genetic level is not healthy, and it's not something that to boast about, and geneticists will agree with me on that fact as well. Okay. Indicating that they share a common ancestor. Now, remember what I said, this ancestor goes back 15,000 years, and all people carry a more recent common ancestor than that, so that's totally irrelevant. Among modern-day Egyptians, this haplogroup contingent is below 1% according to ydna. It was very interesting to discover that he belonged to a genetic group in Europe. Now, notice that they didn't mention anything about Africa, and we're going to come back to that. It was very interesting to discover that he belonged to a genetic group in Europe. There were many possible... So, sorry, let me not skip over that, because this is the key one here. He belonged to a genetic group in Europe. Now, I really want you to really fathom the phrasing here. He belonged to a genetic group in Europe. Now, this is the way genetics are working at the moment, and this is one of my key problems of it. Because of this marker's proliferation in Europe, Europe now, by default, becomes the owner of this marker. Now, even according to their own studies, this marker did not originate in Europe. According to their studies, it originated in Western Asia. And according to a study that I'm going to show you in a moment, it originated in Central West Africa. Now, all that aside, they know that those are the two possible origin points, i.e. either Western Asia or Africa. And yet they say he belonged to a genetic group in Europe. And they're not just saying this. All of the ancestry tests will classify this marker as a European marker, all of them. And their reason for doing it is because now lots of the people carrying it happen to be in Europe, irrespective of where the Europeans inherited from, and irrespective of how long it's proliferated in Europe. So this is already one of the big issues I have. I'm going to quickly just earmark this for you guys, and I'm going to say issue number one, and this is one that's going to come up quite a lot, is the geographic placement of markers. I don't believe markers should be placed against the geography. It's impossible to place a marker against the geography. What that does is it gives you a very binary, very static view of human migration. This idea that a group of people start here, then 5,000 years later they move here, and then they stay there, they don't go anywhere. Then 5,000 years later they move back. Humans do not move like that. Humans are very much organic, and in some ways, I'd love to come up with a better word, but it's correct, in some ways cancerous in our movements. We are constantly ebbing and flowing in and out of populations. Okay, there's constant population overlap depending on what's taking place. Even this whole idea of static sub-Sahara is being totally blown out of the water by the movement of haplotypes that is being picked up in genetic studies. So like I said to you before, I'm not against genetic studies. What I'm against is the false interpretation of data. So this is one of them. Taking a marker and then giving it a geographic placement is incredibly problematic. You can't call this a European marker. It's impossible. It just occurs in too many places. You can't give the place that has the most people. And the reason they have the most people, by the way, as well, is also linked to the fact that they test the most as well. And these are all things we're going to cover. We've got so many things to cover in this, so please bear with me, okay, because we've got to cover. There were many possible groups in Egypt that the DNA could have belonged to, said Roman Schultz, the director of ydna Center. Around 70% of Spanish and 60% of French men also belong to the genetic group of the pharaoh who ruled Egypt more than 3,000 years ago. We think the common ancestor lived in the Caucasus about 9,500 years ago, Schultz told Reuters. It is estimated that the earliest migration of the haplogroup, blah, 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 so that's what it is, R1b1a2, into Europe began with the spread of agriculture 7,000 BC, according to ydna. So it came from Western Asia into Europe, but now they call it a European marker. However, the genetics were not sure how Tutankhamun's paternal lineage came to Egypt from its region of origin. Now, this is really interesting because I'm sure the geneticists would have absolutely known about this particular marker's proliferation across Central, West, and actually East Africa. It's actually a relatively popular marker in those regions. Obviously, nothing like the proliferation you get in Europe because you just don't get that in Africa, but it exists. But they've left it out completely because that is inconvenient to the story they are trying to sell. So this is where we're going to get onto thing number 2. I should write these things down. In fact, I'm just going to get a notepad out and write these little points down because it's really important, and I'm going to want to recap them as we go on through the day. So just bear with me because I'm actually going to write this down. Okay. Sorry, I'm going to pull up my notepad. Bear with me. So I'm going to have to summarize these notes. Where's it gone? Where's Notepad? You know your PC struggling when it takes a while to open up Notepad, isn't it? Okay. So I believe point number 1 is geographic placement of markers. That's a big problem, okay? And we'll revisit that a few times. Point number 2 is use markers to communicate a story or propaganda that an author wants to tell. And this is really important. Whatever story you want to tell with DNA, you can essentially tell it. This is the funny thing, and this is what people seem to miss. It's just like I did a live stream, I think a little while back, and I was talking about Ancestral Brew, which is another channel, and he has all of these fanciful tales about DNA in amongst the Egyptians. He doesn't even use ancient Egyptian DNA. He just used current Egyptian DNA and makes a big story up about how it's drifted in from the Levant and it's gone through here, and they walked along the delta and they they picked flowers, and then they went back into Turkey, and then they came back. It just makes stuff up, pulls stuff up out of his rear. No anthropology to support it, because this is one of the things that you'll note when people rely purely on genetics. They don't have any anthropology to support it. There's no linguistics. Like, okay, cool, if they all came from there, do we have any trace of their language? No. Do we have any trace of their culture? No. Do we have any trace of anything else? No. But we got their genetics. Okay, but do we know for sure that that marker came from here? Well, this is the oldest place where we have the marker, but it could have come from somewhere else. Yes, but we don't have those samples. Are you excavating in those places that you don't have samples for? No, we're not excavating there. It's really hard to get samples from there because those tropical regions are all wet and nothing gets preserved. Do you see the problems as they're mounting? Okay, there's so many problems with genetic testing. So anyway, I'm going to now dive into some other stuff because I've been talking for a little while. So now I'm going to dive into a little bit of other stuff because I actually feel over prepared for this somewhat, which is nice for a change. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to talk about this R1b marker. And I think this entire story, which, by the way, has already been debunked because Hawass came out and said this is a complete lie and this wasn't the marker that Tut has. But let's just say this is the marker that Tut has, and they do a real test and they find out that he is R1b1a2. I'm absolutely 100% comfortable with Tut being R1b1a2. One of the reasons why is because it has very clear native proliferation across Central, West, and East Africa, and quite a bit of it. Okay, so that would just if you're coming from our perspective, once again, support the idea of this homogeneous Nilo-Saharan region being the basin point for where the ancient Egyptian or ancient Kemetic civilization birthed from. It absolutely supports it. But here's another little kicker. I'm just going to show you this study done in, and they must have been aware of this study, done in 2012 by Gonzalez, okay? And he was talking about the R1b V88 marker, like I said, that marker that's proliferates in Central and West Africa. And just to show you that this is the same marker, I'm just going to quickly show you a diagram. I know you're on mobile, so I'm not sure how clear this is going to come up. I wonder if I can, how close I can zoom in here. Or if I can open this. Oh, once again, no, see full size image. Let's do that. Will it let me zoom in? Okay, that's not any bigger, is it? I should have just opened an image in new tab. That would be better. And then I should be able to zoom. All right, so here we go. So here's the marker, by the way. I just want everyone to see this. Zoom down. So there's the marker V88, and you can see V88 links to V8, and there it is, R1B1A2. So I just wanted to show you really quickly that the V88 marker that I'm referring to here is the same R1B1A2 that was being spoken about, okay, in the other article. And I'm just going to quickly, without us beating around the bush too much, I'm just going to quickly take you to the headlines. I'm going to take you straight to the conclusion of this report because there's no need for me to beat around the bush. So let's go straight to the conclusion of this report. By the way, you can look at this report anytime you like, read it yourself. It says genetic landscape of Equatorial Guinea and the origin of migration routes of the Y chromosome haplogroup RV88. So you can look at that and download it at your own time. It is a free download. You have to pay for this one. If you're sad like me and Wesker and Jonathan and like to read papers over the weekend, you could do that. But I'm going to go straight to the conclusion. Okay, so here we go. Let me close this down. So, the origin of the V88 lineages. Although the recently advanced hypothesis that the V88 lineages migrated with Proto-Chadic speakers from North Africa. So this idea was pushed that it came from the north and then went into Central Africa. He's countering that with this study through the Central Sahara into the Lake Chad Basin, given that a high variance was found in lineages from haplogroup R1B1A in the sample from Equatorial Guinea. So Equatorial Guinea, if you don't know, is kind of the central west of Africa. Okay. I should have a map, but you can look at a map. I'm not going to put up a map right now. Our results are also compatible with an origin of the V88 lineages in Central West Africa. So remember what I told you earlier about variance, because they've got variation of it. And remember I spoke to you about, healthy breeding habits create variety and variance in African populations. Okay. And they can see that also shows longevity. Assuming that Central West Africa is in fact the place of origin for V88, the original Chadic groups in the Lake Chad Basin coming from the north is equally likely as the alternative hypothesis of a migration mediated by the Proto-Chadic speaking people coming from east to West Africa, inter-Saharan hypothesis, which was previously defended by Lancaster. So we see here a central or a continental African proliferation of this marker. Okay, nothing to do with European migration. I'm just going to scroll down to the final paragraph now because I know this is a little bit heavy, but I'm just going to quickly get through this. In summary, altogether our data are compatible with an origin of the V88 derived allele in Central West Africa and a later migration or migrations across the Sahara. So origin in Central West Africa and then spreading out from Central West Africa across the Sahara to North Africa. Assuming this origin for V88, both the trans-Saharan and inter-Saharan hypotheses for the arrival of Chadic groups in Lake Chad Basin are equally as likely as already described in other studies, but this model is also compatible with the dispersion of V88 from Central West Africa to North Africa, and obviously then from North Africa to Europe. So if that indeed was the case, which I believe is the case, that's it. Okay, so I'm not going to read any more of that. I know that was really heavy. But I just wanted to show you those two articles. And the reason I'm showing you those two articles is for a very important reason. On the one hand, you have Reuters. And by the way, Reuters were not the only one to cover this King Tut must be European crap. Okay, this was, in fact, I want to show you this in real time, how real this, I wouldn't say was, but I'm going to say how real this is. King Tut European. That's all I'm going to type in. All right. King Tut European DNA. And I want to show you how many, not just blogs and nonsense, I'm talking about how many properly published, credible, in inverted commas, news resources reported this. Reuters, half of European men share King Tut's DNA. Okay, Reddit we can ignore. NBC News, are half the men in Europe related to King Tut? CTV News, King Tut may have been more European than Egyptian. Progress, I don't know that one. But guys, you can see this live science. King Tut related to half of European men. Oh, well, this one I think says maybe not, so maybe this one actually covers it properly. Guys, you can see this, yeah? Australian Broadcasting Corporation, half of European men share King Tut's DNA. This is not some small deal, okay? This is a article and a conclusion based off one company just basically saying, oh, King Tut has R1B. You had all of these Western newspapers picking up this soundbite, and I'm sure if you've been in any of the kind of like comment sections, you've had some cocky British fella come along and go, well, that's a great reconstruction, but according to his DNA, King Tut was British. It's like, come on, man. We've all debunked, like, this has debunked itself. And hopefully now, given that I've given you this second article, we know that not only does R1B have a reason for being Africa, it actually, R1B 1A2, that specific subclade, has its origin in Africa, according to this study. So according to this study by Gonzalez, 2012, okay, it has its origin in Africa. But this is one of the many reasons why I am such a haplotype skeptic, and hopefully I'm building that picture up for you. Okay, so that was my introduction, followed by a kind of living, breathing example as to the kind of nonsense that you're going to get and going to confront if you wholesale buy into the interpretations of genetic markers, uniparental markers, SNPs, haplogroups that are presented by the media, and also by, you know, anthropologists who deliberately aren't skilled in genetics, but therefore, as a result of not being geneticists, are able to come up with really poor conclusions based on, you know, based on genetic tests, and not be accountable to that false information that they put out, because that's not their field of study. And that these are all the different things that are taking place. Okay, so let's now dive into some stuff. Okay, and this is now, like I said to you before, in terms of my approach of this topic, I'm going to be really, really basic. And what I'm going to do is I'm hoping that I paint a really simplistic picture for you about what you're actually getting when it comes to certain bits of information, when it comes to, you know, interpretation of autosomal, ydna, mitochondrial DNA. We'll cover a few of these different things, like I said, at a very, hopefully at a kind of a leisurely enough pace that I don't lose a lot of you guys. Okay, so if I'm losing you at this point, by the way, do put it in there. You know, if it's going over your head, let me know. If you know, if I've missed something, just let me know. Kind of talk to me. I have got my left eye, okay, on the comments feed, so I'm keeping kind of an eye on it. All right, but I'm gonna get into it now. All right, so haplotype mathematics. So I've got a few diagrams for you, and as you know, I like to be quite visual with the things that I discuss. So this diagram is showing the contributing ancestors to a single individual over 7 generations. Okay, so what am I showing here? So here's an individual here. Let's call him King, okay, or Bob, or Tunde, whatever you want to call him. You call him, okay. And this is all of his contributing ancestors over 7 generations. Okay, so obviously his parents are up here. So here's King. His parents are up here. Mum and dad up here. 2. We go up 2 generations. We've got 4 contributors, or 4 grandparents. We go up 3 generations. We got 8 great grandparents, and so on. So if I go up, you can see how quickly this multiplies. Obviously, we're factorizing this by every generation, you know. And just to give you the numbers on it, let's just scroll down to the next one. Okay, this one actually has the numbers. By 7 generations, you have 128 contributing ancestors. So I want you to really fathom that. In just 7 generations, you have 128 contributing ancestors. Now, if we're going to go for an average and say that each generation takes around 25 years. Okay, I say 25 years as an average because obviously now it's later. I'd say the average generation now is probably between 30, probably about 30, 31, 32. But obviously going back to our parents' generation, it was younger. And then back before then, late teens to early 20s was a good breeding age. So let's say the average generation going back through time is 25 years. Okay. So if we count this through time, okay, 100 years, so 25, 50, 75, 100 years, that's 16 contributed ancestors. 125, 150, 175, 200. 200 years, we're looking at 256 different ancestors who've all contributed. Well, in a single line, by the way. This is like in a single horizontal line, I should say. More than that in total. It's a sum of all these in total. But if we're going to say 256 are the contributing ancestors at that moment in time it's going to take to create you. Now, why am I giving you this data? Because I want you to think about it in the realm of single line or uniparental markers. So those of you who don't know, your ydna comes from your paternal lineage. And by paternal lineage, it doesn't mean all of the men in your ancestry. It means your dad, his dad. So you can see this blue line I've got here. His dad and his dad and his dad and his dad and so on. So along every line of your ancestry, it's only one individual that's ever passing that to you. Only one. So if we're only going back 2 generations, it's quite significant. Okay, cool. Well, we're going back 2 generations. That's 1/4 of your ancestry. It's 1/4 of what makes you you, because essentially you've got that from your dad's dad. But once we go back, like I said, a couple of 100 years, it's already literally in just 200 years we've got 256 contributors. So already in 200 years, that marker's contribution to who you are as a person is minuscule. It's absolutely minuscule. It's 1/256th of who you are. Now, here's a really sensible and normal question I'm going to give to you, and I'm going to hope that you guys have an answer for this. Is it possible that uniparental markers, such as ydna, we're focusing on ydna at the moment, is it possible that your ydna marker can determine your race? That's a real question, by the way. So I'm going to leave that open in the comments. Answer yes or no. Is it possible that your uniparental marker can determine your race? Put your questions, put your answers in the thingy. And while you're putting your answers in, I'm going to explain very quickly that mitochondrial DNA or your mtdna markers work exactly the same way, but on your female side. So you inherit that from your mother. She gets it from her mum. She gets it from her mum. She gets it from her mum. And so on. But you have this, once again, single line of ancestry. One individual who's given you that. Now, women don't get ydna markers, only men do, but men have both ydna and mitochondrial markers but can't pass on their mitochondrial markers. Only women can pass on their mitochondrial markers. Okay, so can your marker determine your race? Got nope. 1 yes, definitely no. Okay, so I'm going to give you the answer, or at least my answer, which I think is, I'm going to think that it's kind of, someone said not race, but an ethnographic group. Yes. I don't think so. No. I'm going to give you my answer. And I thought that you would have maybe started to pull this out from what I've been going through. I'm going to tell you that the answer is absolutely, in my view, by the way, I'm not a geneticist, so you can write me off if you want. My view is absolutely not. Absolutely not. Your ydna or mitochondrial marker cannot tell you a darn thing about your race or ethnicity. It tells you nothing about your race or ethnicity. And to give you a very, very simple analogy as to why it can't tell you, about your ethnicity, let me just give you a quick diagram, because we like diagrams here. Okay, so here's my diagram. So I think I went through this, actually. I did go through this in another live stream, I can't, but I will go through it again. This is Bob. I'm going to say Bob again. I don't know why, I'm just kind of obsessed with the name Bob today. Here's Bob again, okay? And we've created a marker for Bob, okay? Bob has a marker called the ZZ1 marker. Bob's Nigerian, hence he has 3 sons, okay? His 3 sons go to different parts of the world to find their partners. One of his sons goes to England and marries a European. One of his sons goes to Asia and marries an Indian. And his other son goes to Africa and marries a lovely Nigerian woman. Okay? So you got his 3 sons. And remember, he's Nigerian. Okay? He carries a marker called ZZ1. And let's just say, for the sake of this analogy that I'm giving you, that he's the originator of this marker. So some mutation happened in him, and this is his particular marker. So it's only his lineage that are going to carry this marker. Now, his son with the English lady, okay, they have a child, and that's a son, and he also gets with an English lady, as you can imagine. I think the word for that is inertia. He's surrounded by it, so that's what that's what his taste ends up being. And in the end, they have 3 sons who are essentially, now we're talking 1, 2, 3, third generation, 3 generations away from Bob over here. They're essentially now English, okay? In fact, they may not even know that much about their African ancestry, but they all carry that ZZ1 marker. The same thing plays out in India with Bob's other son, and the same thing plays out in Nigeria with Bob's other son. Okay, so a couple of generations down the line, what you have is these Europeans carrying ZZ1, these Africans over here, these Nigerians carrying ZZ1, and these Indians all carrying ZZ1. But they now are essentially the same race as their surrounding people. So here's my other question. So here's question number 2 on this analogy. Well, the first question I gave to you was, can SNPs determine race? To which the answer is no. Unless you're talking about the markers that actually determine phenotypes, such as the SLC markers, which we're not talking about here. I'm just talking about literally the kind of like ydna and mitochondrial DNA haplotypes, the uniparental ones. Okay, so we have 3 groups of people carrying the ZZ1 marker. So my question to you is, what is the ZZ1 marker in terms of where does it originate? Is it a English marker, an Indian marker, or a Nigerian marker? That's another question. And this question is genuinely open. So I know there's a little bit of a delay. So if you're watching this in playback, there's going to be a little bit of a pause now while I wait for feedback in the live stream. So my question to you guys is the ZZ1 marker a Nigerian marker, an English marker, or an Indian marker? Which one is it? Someone tell me. Nigerian, English, or Indian? Which one is it? So I've got Nigerian, a couple of people saying Nigerian. Keep it coming. Excellent. So most of you are saying Nigerian. Okay, I'm going to bookmark that. Okay, I'm not gonna answer if you're right or not at the moment. Okay, but I'm gonna bookmark the fact that most of you are saying Nigerian. Okay, cool. It's a Nigerian marker. Fine. Now, let's say down the line, okay, the sons over here that we spoke about, the Indian sons, okay, So by the way, Bob existed thousands of years ago. This is the thing I didn't tell you. Bob existed actually thousands of years ago. So this isn't a new story. This is a really old story. And these ones over here, the sons in India, okay, end up having lots and lots of sons. And a few generations down the line, they figure out that the builders of the Taj Mahal, they find their kind of like grave sites, and they find that many of the builders of the Taj Mahal were ZZ1 carriers. Okay? So the builders of the Taj Mahal were ZZ1 carriers. Now, as a result of the builders of the Taj Mahal being ZZ1 carriers, they've been doing their genetic testing. And they found out that actually the ZZ1 marker is prolific in Hartlepool. In fact, 50% of the Hartlepool population in England carry the ZZ1 marker. The ZZ1 marker is also present in Nigeria, but it's kind of just lost amongst the melee of other markers. So it comes up very rarely and sporadically. But it has very, very strong presence in England. Okay, 50% coverage. Now, I think you all know where this is going. What do you think they'll tell you about the builders of the Taj Mahal as a result of this? What do you think the headline's going to be on Reuters or ABC News when they find out that the Hartlepool marker is, carried by the builders of the Taj Mahal carried the Hartlepool marker? Someone tell me, what do you think the headline's going to be? I think you know where I'm going with this. Yeah. So Wildflower was definitely first off the mark there. They're going to basically say, English settlers civilized India and brought about the building of the Taj Mahal. The English introduced architecture into India. That's exactly what they're going to say. Now, is it equally true that Nigerians built the Taj Mahal? Because we've all agreed earlier that it's a Nigerian marker, so therefore ZZ1 turns up. Shouldn't Nigerians get the credit for building the Taj Mahal? No, is the answer. Nigerians certainly should not get the credit because they had nothing to do with it. All that happened is that one of Bob's sons came and dropped his seed, and he just happened to be lucky enough that his seed proliferated to the point where it had quite a lot of impact. And that can just be simple as having enough sons for you to have that kind of impact in the population back in the day. Literally. That's all he done. He didn't change the fabric of India. They didn't start speaking a Nigerian language. Okay, they weren't practicing a Nigerian culture. They were Indians speaking Indian language, practicing an Indian culture. The presence of the ZZ1 marker is totally irrelevant to the building of the Taj Mahal, which was an Indian achievement. It doesn't matter if you classify it as a Nigerian marker. It doesn't matter if you classify it as an English marker. It was an Indian achievement. Unless you've got the anthropology to back the story up, i.e. you go to India and you find that they spoke a Nigerian language and they, used Nigerian tools, and you measured you checked their skulls and they had some of them had Nigerian skulls, then you can go, there's definitely a Nigerian presence here. You can't infer a presence of a people based on the occurrence of a marker. So going back to my earlier question to you guys, is it a Nigerian marker? Is it an Indian marker? Is it an English marker? It's none. It's just a marker. That's all it is. It's just a marker. And all it proves is that people move. No one geographic region can take, you have so much, being made about, Anatolian markers and this, that, and the other. If the anthropology isn't there to back it up, the marker is irrelevant. It doesn't matter where the people came from, because essentially all it proves is that they came and they assimilated to the culture, and therefore they probably would have been absorbed anyway. So it's really important you understand that these things need to go hand in hand. Okay, they need to go hand in hand. So I know I'm beleaguering that point, but it's such an important point to make. And this is one of the reasons why I do not run away with myself when it comes to the occurrence of markers in populations. Okay. I'm going to show you some videos now, because I think we've been doing good here, guys. Thank you for sticking with me, and the community here is actually just growing. So it's really fantastic to see that people are so interested and locked into the subject. So thank you guys so much. Let's watch some videos now, because I've got some real good stuff to take you through. And these videos are just going to give you what I hope is a healthy skepticism. Which is that's all I'm trying to do at the moment. If you're wondering what is King doing here, all I'm doing is trying to make you skeptical, all right? Healthily skeptical. You're not throwing the baby out with the bathwater. You're not, totally disregarding genetics and DNA. But what you are saying is actually this is giving me a very limited story or very limited information about this population, and DNA can never, ever overwrite anthropology. It can't. Okay, anthropology always has to be at the forefront. Okay, and we have to take that both ways. That's even when the DNA agrees with us, we have to have that same healthy skepticism, guys. So I'm saying that both ways. I'm not just saying you can't once again pull out the party poppers when you get and I'm not talking about autosomal DNA here, I'm talking about SNP markers specifically. When you get a ydna SNP that happens to tell the story that you like, you can't run away with that. It's important that you don't. There has to be something to support it. It has to be part of a grounded, there has to be some grounded research, and once it supports those other elements of anthropology, then it's something that you can do do something with. So anyway, let me show you this video. So the first video I'm going to show you is, I'm going to show you this video first of all, because this is actually a really good one to start with. No. I really thought I was doing the right thing preloading all of these, and all I've done is confuse myself. This one. Let's start off with this one, because I think this is a really good one. So hopefully the sound works. Let's have a look. Boom, boom, boom. And play.
Very few people who think they have Native American ancestry actually do, particularly when it's a great-great-grandmother, right? If you're immediately in a tribe, of course, but you don't need a DNA test for those. Ethnicity is really interesting.
Now, quick disclaimer. I'm not going to co-sign that first statement he made, because I know it was politically loaded, okay? He came in with the very few people who think they have Native American ancestry do. That is specifically targeting African Americans, I believe, because a lot of people are using their ancestry test to claim Native American ancestry, and he probably doesn't like it. So aside from that first statement, which was politically loaded, the rest of this dialogue is very good. So let's dive back in.
But it's also highly variable, and it's one of the things that's based on statistical analysis. And I think I do want to talk about this a bit, because a lot of the DNA tests are based on statistical analysis. It's not a direct test, like the BRCA is a good example. If you get the full test from Myriad Genetics through your doctor, that is pretty certain. But if you just get the what's called a SNP test analysis...
So I'm just going to bring that back, because I had a bit of a screen issue there. Let me bring it back and let you guys, because that would have been distracting. I'm going to bring it back a bit.
That's based on statistical analysis. And I think I do want to talk about this a bit, because a lot of the DNA tests are based on statistical analysis. It's not a direct test, like the BRCA is a good example. If you get the full test from Myriad Genetics through your doctor, that is pretty certain. But if you just get the what's called a SNP test from 23andMe, that's much more questionable. Similarly with the ethnicity testing, you will get an analysis back from the company, whether it's Ancestry, 23andMe, MyHeritage, FTDNA. These are the main companies that do this work. they will give you an estimate of your ethnic background. And it could be, in my case, for example, I always thought it was Irish and Scottish, right? I mean, that's, so many of us are. Well, when I found out that I have a bit of French in there, that's kind of cool, right? That's interesting. But is that real? And that's where we're not really sure, particularly with those non-European ancestries. At the moment, virtually all of the databases are dominated by people of European ancestry, right? People in the US, Canada, Europe, they're the primary contributors. So the database has a lot of information on those people, those ancestries that date back to Europe.
So I'm just going to pause it there because this is one of the points that I raised before, and he's stating it there quite well. So one of the biggest problems that you have, and this problem still does exist. In fact, I'd say in some ways it's increasing because the kind of gradient of uptake for ancestry tests is very, very strong amongst Western Europeans, Americans included. So what you have, when it comes to DNA as a whole, you must understand that DNA is just essentially random coding that is entirely useless in isolation, but when compared against databases is where it becomes powerful. So you think of DNA as just patterns within the genome, and one of the things you're going to hear repeated ad nauseum is the fact that all people have got 99.9% identical genomes. So the base coding of all human beings is 99.9% identical, and then we have this 0.01% variance where all of this stuff exists. And in terms of the code itself, the code, all of these differences is just gobbledygook. It doesn't mean anything until we place it in the database, and that's when patterns start to form, and we can say, oh well, these ones look the same, so actually we've got a marker here because we see this pattern appear in this many people. So you've got all of these markers appearing across populations. Now, I think you've heard the expression garbage in, garbage out, and essentially analysis is never going to exceed the data placed into it. Okay, so you've probably heard that expression garbage in, garbage out, and that's based on the fact that if you have a database that is rubbish, it's going to give you rubbish out. It doesn't matter how well you analyze it, it doesn't matter what kind of formulas you pass through it, the output of the database is ultimately going to be rubbish. And at the moment, what I'd say is we don't have rubbish databases, but what we have is skewed databases. We have biased databases. So you have, for instance, let me give you the ludicrousness of it. Should it be possible as a British person to take an ancestry test and to come out 100% British? This is another question. This is such an important question. Should it be possible as a British person to take an ancestry test and it comes out 100% British? And I'm going to load that question with this with this other question. And the second question should answer the first question. Is there any evidence of mankind? Is there any anthropological, archaeological evidence that mankind originated in Britain? No. And in fact, one of the geneticists that I'm going to show you, one of their videos I'm going to show you, Dr. Selena Brace, speaks about the fact that Cheddar Man, who's that kind of like great British ancestor, they call him a great British ancestor, but she says quite clearly, Cheddar Man, who existed 8,000 years ago, isn't related to anybody in Britain now. She says that unequivocally without any shadow of a doubt. She says, Cheddar Man, he's not related to anyone in Britain. It's highly unlikely. There are people who carry, once again, an SNP marker, but that's because they have older shared ancestor. In terms of direct relation, she was absolutely confident that Cheddar Man is related to no one in Britain. Do you know why she was confident of that? She's confident of that because she says between now and 8,000 years ago, there have been 2 population replacement events in the UK. 2. And she said these have been wholesale population replacement events. In other words, the modern Brits who are here now are not in any way, shape, or form related to the Brits that were in the British Isles 8,000 years ago. So Britain has no long-lasting footprint in Britain. In fact, you could trace modern Brits back to Britain at the very oldest, maybe 4,000 to 5,000 years ago, where you find an ancestor of modern Brits in Britain. You can only go back 4,000 or 5,000 years. Now, every single marker, SNP marker, that they make conclusions based on, including the R1b marker, far predate that. Do you understand that? So how is it that people are taking genetic tests who are British and coming up 100% British? That should be impossible, because that means basically it's saying that, well, you have no ancestors apart from British, but British people only began existing at the very most 4,000 years ago. Before then, they were something else. Before then, there was mixtures from here and mixtures from or whoever it is they descend from. And obviously, ultimately, you don't have to go back very far before everyone becomes African. So everyone who takes an ancestry test should be coming back at least 50% African, and then everything else should be added on top of that. You're 50% African, 4% Neanderthal, and then, yeah, okay, cool. But then since then, you've had more recent admixture of here, there. That never happens. None of these ancestry tests are saying that. And there's a reason why they're saying that. It's the reason that he's giving you here now. All of these markers that they're finding in people in Western Europe, none of them are being taken outside of Western Europe. They're saying, well, we have this in such a high prevalence that we're just going to call it the Scunthorpe marker, or the Lancashire marker, or the Derby marker, or whatever, the Rugby marker, whatever it is. We'll just call it that marker because loads of people in this area have it, without any thought that that marker has an origin or is placed outside of the UK. So when these markers start to appear in anthropology of other areas, such as in King Tut, they'll even go to the extent of saying King Tut must have been British, even though King Tut predates the British population. Do you see the lunacy of it? And this isn't just random people, like I said, this is credible news. Well, credible, not really credible, but these are quote unquote credible news resources who are backing this kind of data. And you have to understand, this is happening across the board. It's total data manipulation. Anyway, sorry, I ran over. Let me let him speak.
But when we start looking at people with African ancestry, Asian ancestry, and so on, the data is not quite as reliable because the numbers just aren't there. And there's a lot of intermarriages that blend the DNA from these different groups. And crucially, what's most important is that what divides an Irish descendant from an African person is such a tiny fraction of our genome. I mean, all humans are 99.9% identical in their DNA base. So we're looking at one base in 1,000 potential difference between the two most diverse people on the planet. So we have to parse out that and then try to make an interpretation based on statistical frequencies. How often does this particular 1 in 1,000 base occur in these populations in Ireland as opposed to the Gold Coast? And there is no DNA that is unique to any ethnicity. So there's no marker that we can look at and say, okay, this person carries this particular DNA sequence, therefore they must be Irish and nothing else.
Did you get that, guys? I'm going to bring that back because it's the point that I just said a moment ago, okay? There is no DNA that is unique to any ethnicity in spite of what you're being sold. So when they tell you, oh, well, this K marker is the Maghreb marker, or this marker is the such and such marker, that's not how it works. All they're telling you there is currently there is a proliferation of that marker in this area. They're not telling you that it disperses into different areas and normally has random happenstances in different parts of the population, different parts of the globe, because this happens with every single marker. What they're telling you is, oh no, yeah, this marker can be tied to a race or an ethnicity, and it can't. It's impossible. Anyway, let me bring that back in case you missed it.
1 in 1,000 base occur in these populations in Ireland as opposed to the Gold Coast. And there is no DNA that is unique to any ethnicity. So there's no marker that we can look at and say, okay, this person carries this particular DNA sequence, therefore they must be Irish and nothing else. Everybody overlaps all around the world. So it comes down to a statistical analysis, and so people are sometimes disappointed when they see their ethnic breakdown and they say, hey, I'm 2% Asian, where did that come from? Well, that could just be an anomaly in the statistics.
So listen to this point, guys, okay? I'm 2% Asian. Where does that come from? So remember what I said to you about markers. So listen to his answer here, because this is very, very key.
Well, that could just be an anomaly in the statistical analysis. Or perhaps you do have some Asian way back when.
So just to tie that point in to what I gave you here. Oh yeah, there's a marker. That means I'm Nigerian, right? Well, could mean you're Nigerian. Could just mean you're Indian. Could mean that you're British. Could mean that you're anything. Okay? Essentially. All right? Just because a lot of people have it in Scunthorpe, like we said earlier, doesn't mean that you've got relatives in Scunthorpe. Okay? And it doesn't mean that you've got ancestry in Scunthorpe. Okay? Your ancestry, if you're over here, traces back to this guy over here. So do you see how it's really important that you have to have this perspective? It's really, really important. So anyway, that's that video done. I think that's an excellent video. It's one I did want to share that with you guys, and we have a few to get through now. So yeah, let's skip to, are we covering Brace today?
How they all interact.
I'm trying to see where she is in my run of things. So we're here. Okay, let's cover Brace. Why have I got a different watch code there? I know that's the right one. Yeah, brilliant. Yeah, let's cover Brace. All right. And yeah, let's cover Brace. So I'm going to start with, I think I gave you this quote last time. So we're actually on it just right now. So I want you to all listen to this. And this is about African genetic diversity. Okay, so yeah, let's cover this because this is quite important.
Indeed, it's fair to say that in recent studies from modern African populations, they found more than 100 places in the human genome where people vary, where there are variations that can be associated with skin pigmentation. So to sort of clarify, these are sites in the genome where I might have a C and you, Mark, might have a T. And when individuals have a different base at a single site, we call it a single nucleotide polymorphism, or SNP for short. So you quite often hear people talking about SNPs, and that's what they're talking about. So there are a lot of these SNPs associated with skin pigmentation. Some of these variations are found specifically within genes where we know the effect of those genes. And the effect of those genes are, they can be on genes that make either a different type or a different amount of melanin. Now, melanin is the body's natural skin pigment. And so this will affect the amount of skin pigment that an individual produces.
We all have it.
Yes, we all have those genes. And these genes have names, and the important ones are ones like MC1R. And in Europe, specifically in Europe, there's a suite called the SLC genes, 24A5 and 45A2 are the key ones, and another one called TYR. But what's interesting is, so whilst there are many, many SNPs associated with skin pigmentation, the most recent studies are indicating that only a few of these SNPs, only a few of these variations seem to be responsible for the largest effects in skin pigmentations, the largest differences, and that these SNPs are shown as signals of selection in populations through time.
Okay, so I showed you this clip on my last live stream, and I want to go back and re-emphasize that point. She started off by saying there are around 100 or just over 100 SNPs associated with skin pigmentation in Africa. So you probably noted that she said in Africa, where there are about 100 genes associated with skin pigmentation. She then went on to talk about Europe, of which there are 4 known genes for skin pigmentation. The SLC245A, the SLC45A2, the NC1R, and the TYR gene. Those are the 4 genes known to affect skin pigmentation in Europe. So over 100 affecting pigmentation in Africa, 4 in Europe. And the reason I raise that is because that kind of ratio is consistent across the board between Africans and Europeans. That's the difference. So Africans are, by several factors, more genetically diverse than Europeans. So we have so much more contributing to our differing phenotypes and differing physiology than Europeans do, who have a much more narrow set of genes doing essentially those jobs. So the reason I raise that is because on point of what we're actually discussing today, which is DNA testing, imagine the very scant amount of DNA data, genetic data that they've collected. Sorry, the very scant, I'll just turn my mic to me. Thanks for noting that, please. The very scant amount of genetic data that they've actually collected from the African continent, bearing in mind it's 25 times more genetically diverse, if that, than Europe. You can imagine the disservice that's being done. And also compound this with the fact that geneticists will tell you that, historians will tell you, archaeologists will tell you that excavations in Africa are very difficult because we're talking about humid, hot climate. It's very hard to find old bones that have preserved well in equatorial Africa, okay, across, any of the tropical regions of Africa. So these places that have the most probably dense amount of genetic data, historical genetic variety, we're not getting tests currently because Africans just basically aren't that interested. Obviously, there is some interest, but it's nowhere near the kind of interest you get in Western Europe for genetic testing. And B, we're getting no archaeological data. So they're finding old bones in, like I said earlier, Anatolia, Russia, this, that, and the other. And they're like, well, this is where the marker must have originated. And they're only saying that because that's where the oldest bones are. It doesn't mean that there weren't older occurrences of it elsewhere in Africa, which is probably where they were. Well, probably most of these markers did probably originate in Africa, given that migrations to and from Africa, to and from Europe were probably quite frequent, but then they probably would have kept those, migration routes open and visited, gone back and forth. But that aside, let's just talk about the fact that it's very likely that most of these markers have their origination point in Africa, but it will be very hard to prove this. And this is why when they build whole dialogues and they build whole kind of paradigms and theses based on the fact that they have this very limited viewpoint that is very heavily skewed towards Europe, even though they know about Africa's genetic diversity, even though they know about the problems of storing, DNA archaeologically in a climate that is warm and humid, that doesn't preserve very well, they'll just continue because this bias suits them. It kind of gives them carte blanche if, well, hey, we're getting to tell the story we want to tell, don't we? Because, hey, all the good frozen bones are found in Europe, yeah, with the preserved DNA. Yeah, all of our people are doing the test. We can essentially tell any tale that we like. Now, I think it's important for us as Africans to be healthily skeptical towards the conclusions that they're drawing. One such study which did this, with such aplomb was the Schooneman study. Okay, and we know the Schooneman study was the one that basically where they tested a bunch of mummies. They found 3 mummies. They found an Abu Sir al Malik, which is basically right next to the Fayum in Egypt in the late period. So this is well after the kind of true pharaonic dynastic period. They tested these mummies and they were like, oh, well, the Egyptians are related to the Levantine. They're not related to anyone else. You know, they're related to modern Egyptians and people from the Middle East. They don't carry any black DNA. They said sub-Saharan, but that word's a slow on here. No, they don't carry any black DNA. And there were so many problems with the study. So many problems with the study. The problems were, once again, they're relating these markers to the markers that they're first of all relating and calling Levantine markers. They're only calling them because they don't have the data to be able to say these were African markers. So some of these people may have even carried high amounts of African DNA. Secondly, they tested mummies that were likely not indigenous Egyptians, but likely migrants, people that had come with later invading classes of Egypt. And there's just so many problems with the study. It's been debunked a million times. I've got a whole video on it, so I'm not going to go into it right now. If you want to watch it, it's called The Great DNA Hoax. It's very good. I do plug it, do watch it. But the point being, this is one of the main reasons why, you have to be healthily skeptical towards all of this data that they give you. Okay? You have to be very, very skeptical towards it. But that's Dr. Selena Bray. She's actually quite brilliant. I don't know if she's got other stuff that's a little bit more biased or whatever, but every time I hear her speak, she's actually really good. I learn a lot from her. So if you do get a chance, have a look for this video. It's actually really informative, and I will cover more stuff from this video at a later date, but we've got a lot to cover today. Let's do this one. This is this is a good one. Boom. Okay. I'm just going to play this from here.
G's that form the instructions that make us, us. Of these 3 billion base pairs, 99...
I'll bring it back here.
To understand how genetic ancestry tests work, let's start with the DNA itself. There are about 3 billion base pairs in our genetic code. Those are the A's, C's, T's, and G's that form the instructions that make us, us. Of these 3 billion base pairs, 99.9% are exactly the same in all humans. But for the remaining 0.1%, one person might have an adenine where another person has a guanine. These single-letter differences are called single nucleotide polymorphisms, or SNPs. Groups of SNPs can help explain why some people are taller than others, or why some people have green eyes while others have brown eyes. But most SNPs have no known effect at all. What many DNA tests are looking at are a relatively small number of SNPs, specific positions in this 0.1% in our DNA, in order to give you your results. When a testing company receives your sample, they compare your pattern of SNPs to different reference populations in their database. These reference populations contain SNPs known to exist more frequently in different modern populations in the world. Then the testing company will give you a percentage that represents how strongly your pattern of SNPs resembles that group. But this process has a bunch of important limitations, and this is where things get complicated.
Lots of markers are found in multiple...
So guys, watch from here, because this is actually really important. I wanted to show you that first part, because I think we've been speeding ahead, and it's good to slow down and just kind of get the basics of how it all works. But watch from here. This woman gives very, very good information. So
populations around the world.
First, even trying to classify humans into groups in the first place is tricky. Human genetic diversity isn't organized neatly into groups like countries or continents. Take a look at the distribution of this SNP that affects how a person absorbs folic acid. It's commonly found in Mexico, but also in Chile or even China just as often.
So let's say that a particular marker is found in the South Asian population 30% of the time. There's still a possibility that when you inherited this marker, you got it not from somebody who was South Asian, but from somebody who was in some completely different group that also happened to have that marker.
Second, testing companies put together their reference populations based on academic research and other people that have taken genetic ancestry tests. And most testing companies aren't clear about how many people are represented in their reference populations. So each company might have different reference databases, which helps explain why you might get different results from different companies. So what does this all mean for my results?
This is a probability with a margin of error. So it's not that you overall are 85% West Asian, but that the particular spots that they happen to look at, 85% of those locations are associated with Western Asia in their reference population.
So what about these other results? Am I really 2% African?
You've got a lot of, sort of small trace percentages here. Percentages that small are really not meaningful. Again, because that could be affected by having one person in the database. And if that one person gets reclassified later on because they get, a larger sample, that percentage will disappear.
Ultimately, DNA ancestry tests are really just giving us a probability, the testing company's best guess, and that uncertainty isn't made very clear in the results. Buried in my results, I found this confidence slider.
So I'm going to pause it there because I think that is all I really wanted to cover in that video. But I think one of the really salient points that I want to really focus in on is how these markers are being classified. So once again, I spoke earlier about the fact they shouldn't be classified geographically, but how are we getting these markers classified? Well, there's two areas which you heard him mention there. The first area of classification for specific markers is their own databases. So basically they'll get people from certain geographic region testing, and therefore they'll say that because loads of people from this area tested and shared that marker, we'll start calling it by that name. And I hope you can see how problematic that is, because you could have migrations, take for instance the UK, yeah, and the UK, particularly London. How many markers must be called the London markers? For people who have come from all around the world, done an ancestry test and set it in. It's like, oh yeah, well, you got relatives in London. Yeah, blimey, everyone in the world's got relatives in London on that basis. Now, I don't know if they're that stupid, but you can imagine it happening that way. That's just highlighting the point. The fact that migration into areas can be so recent, populations, not every population that is sitting in an area has been there for a long time. And once again, if you don't have the full anthropological story, then what you're getting is a very, very skewed data set. The second place that they get their data from is from historical researchers. Okay, so they get it from academics, basically, people who say, well, this marker originated here, and they might just take their word for it. Okay, well, these researchers, but then that falls into the same area of problematic area of bias that I spoke about earlier, because people have these biased stories and these biased narratives. So I'll give you one really strong example, okay? I'll give you one really strong example of this. One of the things that Black Africans are plagued by is the slavery narrative, okay? Or as Dr. Shamaka Keita calls it, the slave trope, the black slave trope. And what that essentially is that every time people are found to have relationship to Black Africans, or Black Africans pop up somewhere that they're not supposed to be, and that is essentially globally, because Africa DNA is global, and this is one of the things they're probably finding right now. You have the black slave trope that you can always fall back on, okay? So it's like, okay, yeah, well, we found that these, once again, going back to the Schunemann study, what did the Schunemann study say? The Schunemann study found that modern Egyptians carry 20% Black African DNA. What was their reason for this? Was it perhaps that they're on the African continent? Was it perhaps that the 20% African DNA was the indigenous DNA, and the other DNA, that the Levantine DNA is the foreign DNA? Yeah, that would be logical. That's the logical conclusion I came to. No, the conclusion they came to was that the Egyptians had bred with slaves, slaves who were imported during the trans-Saharan slave trade. I'm sorry, do you have any anthropological data to back this? Because last time I checked, Egypt got all of its slaves from Turkey, okay? They had names, they were called the Mamluks, right? There's no history of Egypt taking slaves from West Africa. zero history of such a thing occurring. Okay, in fact, West Africa at that point in time was a superpower. So good luck, you know, marching over through Mali, yeah, and getting slaves from Africa and then marching them back to Egypt. Good luck with that. The Malian Empire would absolutely annihilate Egypt anywhere, any time from, you know, the late period right through to modern times. I'm not just talking about Mali, Songhai, Nok, all of these great African empires. There was no marching into West Africa taking slaves, but this is the slave trope that we've been plagued with now for the past few hundred years. They just, blacks, slavery must be the answer. No, that's not the answer. And the problem is that trope has leaked its way, as you can see from the Schumann study and other studies, has leaked its way into the way they're interpreting DNA data. So rather than they see, you know, black African markers or markers carried by black African people in Europe, and coming up with a new narrative and saying, oh, well, actually, it looks like here in, you know, Scandinavia that they've got 40% Nigerian ancestry back, you know, or people in Nigeria, similarity to Nigerians back, you know, 300 years ago. They'll just say, oh, yeah, that was just due to, you know, slave trade. There was a rise in, you know, we are not in control of this narrative. So this brings me up to another really, really important point that I want to raise, and that's who controls the narrative. If we don't control the narrative, they can tell any story they want to when it comes to these markers. Any story they want to. And it's really important that we can't just wholesale accept the stories that they tell, because the stories that they tell are always advantageous for the propaganda that they want to sell and always disadvantageous for us as black Africans. They're never complementary. So until we're in control of either these databases or the dialogue that surrounds these databases, we're not going to get a fair shake when it comes to DNA. This is very much an area of study. It's totally subjective. It's not objective. It's totally subjective. And we have to be in control of some of that dialogue. Otherwise, we can't accept it. That's kind of where I'm at with it. We literally cannot. We have to take everything with really high filtration of, you know, bullshit filtering, essentially. We cannot literally just accept what they give to us. Okay, so that's really important. All right, let's. I think we've got like we'll dive into one more video and then we're gonna wrap it up because it's getting late and we can always part two this. Boom, boom, boom. What's the other one? Let's see. Watch that one. This one's good. Okay, let me just get my time. I'm just gonna get my marker.
Actually, very, very reliable.
I got my timestamp. Just bear with me. I've got to find my timestamp and then we'll go from there. Here it is. Here. We're going to go from here.
So when you take a DNA test, if for family history purposes, there are actually two components to the test, though some of the companies also now offer a health report, but I'm just going to focus on the genetic genealogy applications. So you will get, first of all, you will get what is sometimes called an ethnicity estimate, although ethnicity is not really the right word because ethnicity is something that is socially and culturally defined. It's nothing to do with your ancestry, but the companies have rather hijacked this term, and the correct scientific term is actually biogeographical ancestry.
Okay, so first point that I really hope that you got there. Okay, ethnicity has got nothing to do with your ancestry. Okay, I hope you really digest that. Ethnicity has got nothing to do with your ancestry. Okay, ancestry in terms of genetic markers is what she's talking about here. Ancestry in terms of genetic markers are biogeographical. In other words, they tell you about movement. Biogeographical, okay? I know I said I don't like markers being attached to a geographic area, and I stand by that, but she's talking about them being biogeographical, okay? I.e., they, telling you about movement. Okay, so you've got this marker. Well, a lot of people here have this marker, here have this marker, here have this marker. Historically, the people were here, here, and here who had this marker. There could have been people elsewhere. That's a biogeographical marker. Not you've got this marker, you're French, which is what they tell you at the moment. That is totally, totally incorrect. Okay, so I hope that you are getting that point. Can I just give a massive, massive thank you whilst I'm here as well? I've just had a lovely donation come through. Appreciate that. Stephen, my brother, I really appreciate that. Generosity says, thank you once again. You've hit it out of the park. Thank you. I'm glad this seems to be going relatively well without any technical hitches for once. And it's a very loaded topic, but I'm glad that it's resonating somewhat to everyone. So appreciate that donation so much. Let's carry on watching.
So this is a comparison with reference populations from around the world. But if you're a genealogist like me, then the most important part of the test is where you are matched with your genetic cousins from around the world. Now, I'll just give you an overview. I've tested at all the 5 different companies, and these are my percentages from all the different companies. And I'm not sure how much of that you can see, but they are all broadly in agreement that I am a Northwest European. But each company, they have their own reference populations they're comparing you to. They have their own methodologies working out these percentages. You can only be matched to a population that's there. And they also cover different time frames. They are now trying to bring the time frame down more towards the present day rather than looking at ancestry from 1,000 or 2,000 years ago. But then you can see I've got major differences. So my heritage DNA, I come out at 9.2% Italian. At 23andMe, I get as 14.9%, I think it is, French and German. And some of the other companies, I am 100% British, or a very, very high percentage of British. And these percentages also...
Now, did you get that? Now, this might seem really small to you because you're looking at those results and you're just like, well, essentially you're coming out as a white English lady, yeah? They're not making any errors there. Yeah, that's fine. But did you see the divergence in terms of where they were saying she's from? You had some saying she's a little bit Italian, some saying she was a little bit French, some saying she was a little bit German, some saying she's from this part of England. Obviously, this is purely a database exercise. I cannot stress that enough. Because ultimately, all of this stuff, all of these markers she's got that are linking her to different parts of Europe could ultimately these markers could all exist in Africa. And this might just be a very creative way of telling her, hey, you're human. that might be as useful as this is. Hey, you are Homo sapien sapien. That's what these markers are telling you. We don't know, okay? All we know is that people can be, obviously they can make good predictive guesses based on who else carries your marker, but that's all that you're getting there, okay? It's not giving you anything much more than that. So it's just very interesting because this is purely a database exercise. And once again, until those databases, there's 2 things that I think need to happen, okay? And this is when you'll see my skepticism level regarding all of this come down quite a lot, okay? These are 2 things. The first thing is we need a thorough genetic database of the current world's population, not skewed towards any one single population. So we need to see a database that has equal contribution of each population across the globe and good contribution. Because one of the things that worries me as well, and this is, they're very good at manipulating data as well. So for instance, remember, I'm going to give you a really kind of like simple example. And this is something that I fear happens, but I also think happens quite often. So let's say that they find a mummy, okay? And right now, the current trope, all right, amongst the kind of Egyptology is they know they've lost the European argument. That one's dead in the water. So the argument they're pushing now is ancient Egyptians are exactly the same as modern Egyptians. The modern Egyptians haven't had any migration and no one's invaded and they've stayed exactly the same, and all that stuff is all lies, and the people there are the ancient Egyptians. And so in order to prove this, let's say they find a mummy and they want to relate it to the modern Egyptian population. Don't think that they're not so deceptive as to not get DNA from populations that they know they're going to get continuity from. So, they'll just take a little trot down to Aswan. Remember, Aswan is in Egypt. they could just take a little trot down to Aswan, okay? Or even in Cairo, just test people who they know are of Nubian descent, get their DNA, compare it to the mummies and say, hey, look, continuity, there it is. There it is. Don't put it past them that this is what they do. They've done it in anthropological studies when it comes to skulls. When they want true Negroids, they get the most extreme example of a black person, or extreme example. When I say extreme example, I mean the most phenotypically distant person from Europe as possible. And all the people that are phenotypically close, they avoid putting them in those samples. So when they're trying to prove, that an Egyptian skull is European, do you think they have a bunch of Fulani people in their sub-Saharan quota, Somali, Tutsi? Do you think they have a bunch of, elongated, Maasai people in those Kalenjin? Do you think they have any of those people in their sample? No, they're going to take people who they know are completely opposite. They're going to take populations, that are very, very distant and say, this is our sub-Saharan portion. So they're very, very clever and very smart at manipulating data. So in the same way, if they wanted to get affinity between modern Egyptians, don't put it past them that they would get people that they know have got that African ancestry that is going to cluster. That's how data manipulation works. So with all things, like I said, particularly when it comes to this area of DNA, pinch of salt approach works best. Okay, this is my last video that I'm going to show you today. And then I'm going to call it a day, and we'll do a part 2 to this if we need to. Wasn't this one? We've seen this one already, I think. Yeah.
They all interact. Indeed, it's fair to say that in recent...
If the words British history conjure up images of Elizabeth...
Okay, so I'm just going to find my timestamp. This is the last one we're going to watch, and then we're going to call it a day. But this is really good, so do stay tuned, because this one's actually really, really good. And it's short. It's very brief. So blink and you'll miss it. Pay attention, because this is really important. And Selena Bracing, I told you she's quite brilliant. I do like her. Let me just quickly skip forward to here. All right, pay attention.
To Britain. So in that sense, we're unlikely to be related to him. Although
actually, no, let's go back.
What's interesting to know is, I think it's interesting.
I'm going to go back a bit, actually, because she just explains before then about the population replacement events. I think I mentioned that earlier. So just to show you that I wasn't BSing, I'm just going to go back. Let's go back to here. Okay. So we're going to play it from here. Pay attention.
To Cheddar Man, because we're all humans. We're all from the same species. But would modern humans today, people in Britain today, be directly descended from Cheddar Man? It's fairly unlikely, to be honest, because, as we've said, we know that there are these population movements. There are changes in population structure in Britain from this time point. So we already know that people came across from the continent, so farmers migrated into Britain, and we see a genetic replacement then. We've also seen a genetic replacement of people moving into Britain later in time, so during the Bronze Age, the Beaker period, and it's quite likely, to be honest, that that kind of replacement happened again after that. So many different...
So did you hear that? 2 genetic replacements she clearly described there taking place, and she didn't say, diffusion, she said genetic replacement. And this is why modern Britons, up to the Bronze Age, have no relationship to the people that came before, okay?
Types of people have moved into Britain. So in that sense, we're unlikely to be related to him. Although what's interesting to know is, I think it's interesting, is that people, humans in general, we're actually quite inbred in some senses. It really doesn't take very much time that you have to go backwards to find what we call your most recent common ancestor. So somebody who's actually related to everybody who's alive today. In fact, mathematicians have worked it out, and it's in the region to like 7,000 to 4,000 years ago. So
did you get that, guys? Okay, I did say that. 7,000 to 4,000 years ago, mathematicians have calculated, now they could be incorrect, but mathematicians have calculated you have an individual that's related to everyone on the planet. That's very recent human history. So you only have to go back between 7 and 4,000 years. There was an individual on the planet who's related to everyone who's alive today. 7,000 to 4,000 years ago. So what this should do is this should throw out any idea in your mind that you have about SNP markers being able to determine your race. Because SNP markers normally go back several thousands of years, much longer than 4,000 years. Most of them that we look at are 10,000 years, some of them 20,000 years, some of them 5,000, 6,000 years, but most of them are older than this common ancestor that all people share. If we all share a common ancestor that's 4,000 years old, then these SNP markers are irrelevant. Because before ydna and mitochondrial DNA came out, do you think anybody was aware of what their uniparental lineage was? Oh, I can't sleep with her, I can't sleep with him, I must protect my mitochondrial DNA lineage, I must protect my paternal lineage. No one was doing that. Okay, no one knew or cared what their paternal or maternal lineage was in terms of like markers, that is. Okay, there was no preservation of these things. Your paternal grandfather is as important as your mother's dad. Okay, in fact, you might carry more genetic data. Let's just visualize this really quickly, just so everyone gets this point that I'm making. Okay, because this is really important. So I'm just gonna quickly I'm gonna beleaguer this point. Okay, there's your uniparental maternal lineage. There's your uniparental paternal lineage. Okay. This guy over here, okay, who carries your ydna marker that you carry, doesn't contribute any more DNA to you than this guy here. In fact, this guy here could carry more. You could be a spitting image of this guy here. You could carry far greater weighting of this guy's DNA than this guy's DNA. In fact, you might not carry any of this guy's DNA apart from the fact that you have that marker. But in terms of your phenotype, in terms of everything that makes you, your race, you might not carry any of this guy's DNA. So do you understand that these markers are just literally that? I'm glad they're called markers, okay? They're just signposts for us to mark possible population movements and nothing more than that. They're never going to trump physical anthropology, cultural anthropology, linguistic anthropology. They're never going to trump any of those things. Okay, it has to be used in concert with those areas, those disciplines of study which tell you about a population. Because when that doesn't occur, then I would say the easiest thing to infer in those cases is diffusion, in which case where that marker came from is irrelevant. Because let's say the marker came from, let's say R1b ended up coming from China. Does that suddenly make Tut Chinese? No, it doesn't. It means that maybe someone migrated from over there a few thousand years ago and that person ended up being one of Tut's ancestors. But that person wasn't really that relevant because they didn't bring over any language, they didn't bring over any culture, they didn't change anything that anyone did, so they just got absorbed into the local population. Simple as that. Okay, as you can see, I had loads of other stuff, but I think that's more than enough. We've been going on for an hour 45 now, and I'm very satisfied that my brain is tired and that everyone from the UK is probably fallen asleep already. So I would just like to give everybody who joined me for this live stream a massive thank you. I think actually I've got to give someone a thank you for a donation. Not going to miss that. Yes, indeed. Thank you, Sky King. Let's have a read of that. Well done. We'll join the Patreon tomorrow. Thank you, Skykin. I appreciate you. On YouTube, the Africanity of Ancient Egypt, Huggins. I've actually got one of his videos. I was going to play it. In fact, I'm going to play that out now that you've mentioned it, because why not? It is Christopher Ehret. Black African Origins of Ancient Egyptian Culture with Thomas Brophy. Yes, 2 excellent videos that have just been recommended. I don't know why that's not showing on the screen. Let me just pull that up so everyone can read that. There you go. Yeah, so yeah, excellent recommendation there. Anything by Christopher Ehret, I guarantee you probably should consume. And I think on that note, I'm going to play out with one of his videos because it's a really good one. And then we'll call it, I had these Shimorka Keita quotes that I want to cover as well. Maybe we'll do a couple more videos. In fact, just bear with me. 5 more minutes. We'll do a couple more videos before we go today. So let's find the Ehret video. Here we go. All right, so there is. We're going from 21:30. Okay, bear with me. I've got to find it. Here's.
Your choices. People of Irish descent.
Wait. Okay, I'll play from here.
Even someone with a Coptic, seemed to be a Coptic last name from the sounds of things, berating me for being such a terrible human being all these years of my whole career, for ever having thought of Egypt as being African. So anyway, there is a deeper problem here. Genetics may be able to tell us about the different elements in our individual genetic, physical ancestries that we may have partaken, come from in our individual selves. But genes do not at all determine language. It's our own historical, cultural, life experiences, personal experiences that determine what languages speak, not our genes. And we need only look around at each other here in the room to know the truth of that. And it is these experiences also that shape our culture choices and our choice of cultural self-identification. Again, not our genes, it's our historical and cultural experiences. Now, the stories that I want to tell today.
So I just wanted that quote. All I wanted to do was share that quote because I think it's so powerful. Your genes do not determine the language and the culture that ultimately you adopt. And this new emphasis on genes, you have to understand the new emphasis on genetics. Genetics is like the final frontier because Egyptologists knew the moment the doors opened for anthropology to be accessible to people of African descent and just to honest scholars, they knew the game was up. They knew the gig was up. You don't have to go too far back in books of Egyptology when they first entered Kemet, what their actual perspective of the land and the people was. It was very clear. They were trying to justify the fact that they were just surrounded by Africans and an African culture, something they saw as a primitive African culture. They couldn't believe that it was responsible for so much and the stuff that they were finding. And over time, that has augmented. So the gatekeeping elements of anthropology are beginning to fall down as we are seeing today. But genetics is like the final frontier because it's this new landscape where they can essentially just paint the picture that suits them. And we just have to be really wary of how they're going to use genetics. That's why they're trying to say, oh, wow, every minute it's like, wow, what do the genes tell us? What do the genes? The genes don't tell us. The genes cannot bypass physical anthropology. If you pull up a mummy's body, and I think I said this in the other live stream, but I'll say it again. If you pull up a mummy's body and you test his melanin levels and his melanin levels matches black people, he has African limb proportions, he has an African skull with African projections, he practiced in African culture, spoke an African language, looked like a black man in all of his statues. I don't give a shit, excuse my French, what his genes say. He could have one set of genes from China, one set of genes from Japan, another set of genes from Cambodia, and a fourth set of genes from England. I would just tell you that is a black person. That is a black African man. It doesn't matter what you say. That's totally irrelevant. These genetics have to be taken into context. Okay? They have to be taken into context. You cannot, well, I certainly can. I certainly will not allow, fanciful tales that are being drawn up from, genetic studies to override what is essentially rock solid evidence that's being given to us in anthropology about who people were and what their culture was. That's certainly what my approach is going to be. Okay, one last video and we're going to call it a day. I did want to get some of these quotes because I only found this video today. It's a really good interview of Shimorka Keita. by Asar Imhotep. A really, really good interview. It's barely got any views. It's got just like 2,000 views. So I don't know how many people know that this exists. I found it today and I was like, what a gem. So I'm just going to quickly pop to the points that I had marked that I want to share with you, because he just touches on some fantastic points that really just kind of like resonate with what I want to share with you today. So let's go from... Oh, did I go forward too? I went forward too much. Yeah, okay, let's go from here.
Issues that a lot of people don't even really think about. For example, we'll say that the L2 mitochondria haplogroup, right, is African, right? You're familiar with this, right? L2,
Yes.
Yeah, you're familiar with that, right?
Yeah.
Oh, this is an African haplogroup. Well, 80,000 years ago, when there were no people outside of Africa, that at least no sustained modern human populations, no sustained communities of modern human populations, L2 was simply human.
Yeah.
So who gets to talk about and gets to define these categories? See, this is what people should be studying. The young people who are interested in these issues, these are issues that relate to philosophy and epistemology. And
so I don't know if you got that, but that was such an amazing point that he just raised. I don't know if you got that. He just basically said L2 marker now is classified as an African marker because it's seen in these African groups, blah, 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 blah. But then he said, well, actually, if you just go back, I think he said 80,000 years ago, when no one had left the African continent, the L2 marker was it just meant you're human. That's all it meant. And that is so true, because these markers, he's saying, who should get the right to define what these markers are? You find populations with high occurrences of these markers, but these markers might have just existed in the African continent as part of when humans was just Homo sapiens sapien. So when humans were just humans on the African continent, many of these markers might have appeared. Yes, people did migrate out, but they might not have carried out those markers until those markers, they might have carried out those markers with them. Okay, they might have been carrying those markers in. So who decided that they were going to augment that and change that from an African marker to wherever that group settled? Why does the settler group get the preeminence over the marker? Or if you take the modern DNA tests, why do the high percentage groups get to name a marker, when all that proves is that they're a recent, relatively narrowly bred population? These are questions that we have to ask ourselves, because they're very important points. I'm just going to skip forward quickly because he does a really good breakdown where he kind of destroys the Schunemann study that I want to share with you as well. So let me just skip to here.
Have a particular historical document to say, oh, these people moved at this time, tells you, and we know from other documents anyway, that it's been going on a long time. So all of the fancy statistics and the Bayesian analysis and all of that stuff applied to extremely small samples, 1 to 3 individuals for a complete genome, or one, and compared with others, no. But fundamentally and foundationally, the notion of not identifying a core Saharo-Nilotic group or a Northeast African group is the problem with that paper, along with some other things, over extrapolation for the question that they do answer. And actually, the fact that they, even their title is very revealing. The title is...
So before he goes into the title, I think the point that he just raised there was really important. So he's talking about the Schunemann study, 2017 study, when they were like, oh yeah, sub-Saharans, the Egyptians didn't contain any, ancient Egyptians didn't have any sub-Saharan DNA, and sub-Saharan influx, there was a sub-Saharan influx that has affected the Egyptians now, which is why they carry 20% more African DNA than they did before. Okay. He's made a very good point, because this is one of the main problems with that study. That study actually went on the basis that there was no indigenous component. So essentially, ancient Egypt was made up of foreigners. There was no ancient Egyptian, according to them. Okay, and this should be a huge red flag for you, because when they say, oh well, the ancient Egyptians, which is what a lot of people will say, were 40% Anatolian, 30% Eurasian, 20% this, 10% that, and 5% sub-Saharan. Okay, so how much percentage were they Egyptian? No percent Egyptian. There was nobody indigenous to that land. There was no one that was there. Now, obviously, to me, the obvious answer is that indigenous DNA that you have cast aside as being sub-Saharan is the indigenous DNA. And all you're doing is exposing the fact that you are, these are of, foreign classes, essentially, that have brought their additional, genetics into the area. That's clear. That, to me, is the most clear kind of story to tell from that. But it's important, and it's actually quite nice that he's picked up really, really well on that point. So yeah, love that point by him there. And watch him go on now, because he touches on another quite important point.
It was very revealing, because it reveals to me the term race isn't used, but they might as well had said, "Oh, we're doing a race study." They might as well had said that. There are others, but that the data they have is real. There are other things they could have done with that data. They had 90 mitochondrial DNAs that the majority, although not all of them, may have an ultimate Levantine origin. And so by looking at the Egyptian texts and so forth, and contacts over, from the proto-dynastic period on, as well as actual records where they say, oh, people came from Southwest Asia and they worked as weavers, or they did this or did that, they could told a totally different story about that site, that city. They could have told a story about evidence of migration into Abu Sir, consistent with the text, that it was supported that. But no, that's not the story. They chose to tell a race story, which is very intriguing and very interesting. And they need to be called out on that. The leader of that group, they need to be called out.
So that was such a good point. Again, he's talking about the fact that with the study that they did in Abu Sir, they actually had pretty decent data, and they could have told so much story. They could have told a story about, people coming from, foreigners coming, merchants coming into the area. They could have told, stories about how the genetics of just anything. They could have, but they chose to tell a lie based on race, or race story as he told it. So this just once again marries up with the point that I was making at the very start of this broadcast, and that is simply that it's all about the story you want to tell. You can tell any story you want with genetic data. You could tell a truthful story, or you can make a story up. And whatever story you tell, that's it really, isn't it? What we need to do is we need to be on game enough to know when a story is being told that isn't the truth. Once again, we cannot just accept their studies hook, line and sinker, just like Dr. Shamal Keita, is telling us here quite clearly. You cannot accept their studies, as they are. Many of them come with quiet, bad intentions and very, very clear agendas. So when you just quote one of their kind of like studies like it's fact because it's come from a peer-reviewed paper, it must be true. No, you can get absolute bull from these papers. You have to have the wherewithal and the awareness to say, this sounds like it's not consistent with my understanding. Let me check the veracity of this data, what they're giving us. Is there any inconsistencies? You just have to be that bit more astute and that bit more aware of the data that you're consuming. And once again, if you start going down that road of, really trumpeting haplotypes, then just be prepared to die by that sword. That's all I'm going to say. You have to be prepared to die by that sword. Me personally, I would prefer to withhold my support of kind of, SNPs giving us really informative data until I feel like the database has got more of a representative representation. Until I see a whole bunch of those European markers being reclassified as African, I'm not interested. Because right now, just me going on another side rant, right now, if you look at kind of like the genetic marker database, Africa is like a subgroup of a subgroup, the African markers. How is it possible that African markers are a subgroup of a subgroup if everyone descends from Africans? Africa should not African mark should the E, so for instance, the E group is a subgroup of a subgroup, yeah? Shouldn't the E clade be the supergroup and everything else descend from it, considering all people descend from Africans? How is it that the picture that we're getting, the phylogenetic picture that we're being painted has Africa as a subgroup and not as the supergroup that everything descends from? Until I see a tree that looks like that, how can I be interested in these markers and how they're being classified? It clearly isn't being based on any kind of logic. It's not being based on any kind of logic. So this is where I obviously I'm going to remain skeptical until, I can get into the field, or people that I trust, like, Dr. K, to get into the field, actually provide, real revised kind of databases that are logical, based on what we know to be human movement, not based on the fact that, Europe is like some super group that's kind of like spreading its seed all over the world, and until we get that correction, I'm going to remain in this position that I am right now, which is, super skeptical. But I think on that note, we've hit the 2-hour mark, and I'm going to call it a day now. I got to play a bit of Dr. Cater, so I'm happy about that. And Dr. Christopher Eret, who's someone who Sky King reminded me of. So thank you for that donation and for drawing my attention to that. This has been a very fun live stream, and we've kept quite a good crowd, 250 people live at the moment. Please do hit up the likes. Keep commenting, please, because I keep the comments on playback, the live chat on playback, so everything that's being written, people do go back and read it. It's very, very interesting. I can't do it in a live stream often, but what I do often is I play back the live stream and I'll read through some of the comments. So please do, communicate with each other, communicate with me. Leave a comment on the main video and a like on the main video, so it just goes up in the algorithm and we get lots of visits, and hopefully it can get a lot of attention. But other than that, I think I'm going to call it a day there. I am quite tired. It's been a pretty lengthy day, and I appreciate you all for joining me. Have a fantastic evening and weekend. I might have a few new videos going up on a weekend, but I don't think I'll be doing any more lives this weekend. I don't think so. So I think I'm going to take it a bit easy. But thank you guys so much once again. Appreciate you all for joining me. And I think on that note, I'm going to call it a day. Oh, and if you're not already subscribed, and subscribe to the King Mono Show, please, guys. Yeah. That's my second channel. Some really good stuff going on there. If you haven't already subscribed to that, subscribe to the King Mono Show. If anyone could put a link for that channel in the chat, that would be awesome. Yeah. And that's it. Now I'm going to say goodbye again.